Okay, we're getting started by asking the question, what is metaphysics? Okay, so what is metaphysics? Metaphysics is a philosophical term that denotes a number of varying perspectives. So metaphysics is the study of how we relate to the world, how ideas, concepts, facts, and objects are related to one another. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, after his death sometime in the 4th century BC, left behind a great number of philosophical books on the nature of being, existence, causation, particularity, universals, potentiality, actuality, parts and wholes, identity, etc. A profound significance is the topic of the categories, which in these books is a topic of categories which designate the way in which we predicate things into subjects for consideration. Okay? So, in other words, how is it that we're understanding predication itself? Okay? Another way of thinking about this would be to focus on what qualifies. In other words, another way of thinking about the question of metaphysics would be to focus on what qualifies and what quantifies something to be what is. So to predicate something is to describe what it is, the action of what is, okay, or not. So, how all these things are also related to us and each other, okay? So then the ancient scholar Andronicus of Rhodes, who categorized Aristotle's works, placed these books after Aristotle's books on physics. So the term meta, meaning after or beyond, is simply after physics. In other words, Aristotle didn't name the books metaphysics. They were named so after his death by Andronicus of Rhodes, simply because they came after the physics. Now, the thing that I always point out, though, is that the idea of metaphysics still is this idea of going beyond the physical. And then maybe even another way to understand that is we go beyond the physical in order to understand what is physical, and likewise to understand what is beyond the physical. So that's the trickiest part of understanding this, is meta means going beyond, but still in another way, meta also means about bringing a closer focus on something, maybe even abstracting our focus on to something so that we could understand it clearly. And in this case, to understand what is clearly, and likewise to understand what something is not as clearly as possible, right? So, in other words, this gives us insight into the content of the books on being, existence, causation, as just that, beyond the physical. In other words, these books were categorized metaphysics after Aristotle's death, yet it conceptually makes sense that they are after the physics, because after the physics basically means going beyond the physics to still understand what is physical and likewise what is not physical. For you and I, this has to also then do with what is relational, okay? So not only is it going beyond, but also showing relationships, okay? So how ideas, concepts, facts, and objects are related to one another. We should note that this is not a justification for relativism. And we'll talk about relativism later in the class. So if you don't understand what I'm referring to here, don't stress out too much. So given that metaphysics accounts for objectivity in relation to what is relative, okay? So to be clear, relativism is a metaphysical issue, yet it works within the larger structures of intersubjectivity and objectivity, okay? Again, don't get too distracted if I'm losing you there. But we will talk about relativism later on, okay? So for Aristotle, form and substance are related to one another, given that a substance takes on a particular form to be what something is. See, so we're still talking about what is physical here in terms of substance. But we also are going beyond it in order to understand substance abstractly. To understand what something is abstractly is to consider what it is metaphysically as well. Okay? So then what is something, okay? So whether something is made of stone is different than if it is made of paper. And a statue is a form of stone as much as a stone takes the form of a brick in a building, etc. Okay? So the limitations of physicality only serve to enhance our understanding of the metaphysical as beyond the physical. This summation of the beginnings of metaphysics as a fundamental feature of philosophical discourse would be missing something if we forget the significance of negation of being, of non-existence, of what is not causal, of what is not particular, non-identity, and even the principle of non-contradiction. Okay, so we'll look at that later, because and I guess probably the easiest way to understand what that point is really just to consider that the answer is yes. To study what something is to be metaphysical, is to study, is to understand something metaphysically. Okay. However, we also are simultaneously having to consider what is not as well, right? That in other words, we're not always considering things as what they are. We also have to consider absence of things, things that are not present, right? So we're not just studying things, we are also studying the absence of things, or what it means when things are not present. Okay, so that's also something that we need to be really careful with, because when we're thinking about things, we're not just thinking about things. We're also thinking about human beings. We're thinking about ideas, concepts, but we also are thinking about the absence of those things. What it is when people are missing. What it is that when people are located in other parts of history. When they're in another part of the globe. They're not with us, but yet still we're considering them in their absence, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So issues like that. So then metaphysics faces the question of nothing. So this is a subcategory of metaphysics, okay? The controversial 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger thought that metaphysics develops as a way for us to contend with the very question, what is nothing? Okay? So to ask the question, what is nothing, is a purely metaphysical question. At first glance, this appears to be a banality. Yet when we stop to consider what is, as opposed to what is not, we get a sense of the profundity of such a question, right? So there again, we have the difference between what is and what is not, and ultimately what is not becomes a very difficult question to start answering, right? So then this entails that we as living creatures have a tough time contemplating and conceptualizing nothingness, okay? Because we are something, right? In fact, our fear of death encapsulates its physical weight into our basic consideration of the being we possess, alongside that being, the being that is reality on the whole. In other words, existence is something. So we as existing creatures have a hard time contemplating what non-existence is. But yet the contemplation of non-existence, the way in which we understand non-existence, then becomes a metaphysical question by which we are contending with the idea of nothingness, what something is not. Okay? So a negation of being is nothingness, that which is not being. So this elicits anxiety within us as well as our thoughts and actions. The fear of nothingness impels us to the act of living, of being alive, of authentically experiencing ourselves as a being exists, a being that exists in the face of nothingness, in the face of non-existence, is what Heidegger's point is there. And such questions are metaphysical. Okay? So then we move to another subcategory. Metaphysics is the study of identity. So another perspective of metaphysics is identity, personal and of concepts and objects, of who we are and what identifies the world around us, how our identity upholds throughout the duration of time. Okay, so How are things identified as unique or universal? Is our identity based in memory or the memory of others? We tend to think that immortality is only an issue for religious consideration, while overlooking the importance of the written words by which to either keep ideas alive or to ignore them, thus identifying ancient authors long since gone. Okay, so identity is a metaphysical question. How do we understand identity for us personally, and also how we understand the identity of others, and likewise how we understand the identity of things, of ideas, of concepts, etc. Any question about identity, questions of identity, become metaphysical questions as well. How do we understand what identity is? And that doesn't just mean who am I as an individual, which it does mean that, but also what does it mean to identify someone? What does our identity mean after we die? What does identity mean through the passage of time, etc.? Okay, so religion is metaphysical, so that's another subcategory of metaphysics. So we are quickly reminded that all of religion is outright metaphysical, right? So because it's going beyond the physical. Religion is, and also going beyond reason in a lot of cases. So faith is often thought of as metaphysical. As much as a religious person looks beyond physical matters to take faith in what is real and practical in her life. If religious life serves its practitioners, it does so within the relationships between objectivity and subjectivity. Objectivity is all-encompassing, and religious life likewise has a similar scope and reach. The mistakes we make have to do with thinking that metaphysics is strictly limited to religious practice. So in other words, we might think that's all metaphysics is, but that's not true. That's just one feature of how we understand metaphysics, and that is religiously. Okay? So I'd like to think of the reverse, that our metaphysical understanding of things gives rise to religious thought. So, yet I admit such conclusions cannot be strictly determined. Likewise, metaphysics leads our thought to the nature of evil as opposed to the nature of goodness, okay? And the way that pain and suffering and death arise in the world. So, in other words, a way that we understand reality and the reality of goodness, etc., these are all metaphysical questions. So, we can't leave this side of metaphysics without a sentence on a particular common sense view of metaphysics as a way of predicting the future and identifying character traits that accompany celestial activity. Sheer chance, lucky destiny, superstition, fortune-telling, etc. So this is often an area of metaphysics that is not covered in philosophy textbooks, yet it's the most common. So when you go to the bookstore and you're looking in the philosophy section, often there's a metaphysical section nearby, and you go look at those books thinking that you're going to get books on the philosophy of metaphysics. You actually are finding books on fortune-telling and how to read tarot cards, astrology, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is unlike what we usually do in philosophy class. Even if our concern is metaphysical, we still should be able to be skeptical and call into question its claims, joined with the use of our critical thinking, not just thinking as these ideas are put into practical experience or not. In other words, fortune-telling and astrology is usually not called into question and not reasonably analyzed as we would with the way that we consider our thinking in a philosophy class. So just know that metaphysics as fortune-telling, etc., generally is something that goes unquestioned, whereas what we do in this class is critically question how it is that we're examining common ideas, common sense ideas even, right? Common opinion. calling into question common opinion. Okay? So metaphysics is categorial. Okay? This is probably the most abstract, this is one of the more abstract ways in which we understand metaphysics. So another area of metaphysical interest is the notion that we want to know what the nature of ultimate reality is. What in our lives is real and what is not real. What do we think of as something? And when do we think of something as not something? As mentioned earlier, in Aristotle's metaphysics, we find the categories, which are ways in which we predicate things. So in the early 20th century, Heidegger's teacher, Edmund Husserl, named this type of thinking categorial intuition. That is to indicate what something is. Okay? To predicate something means to describe what a thing actually is. So essentially, when we predicate things, we are also considering things as a subject of thought. What's happening to the subject of thought? How do we understand what something is to predicate it, to give it an action. Okay? So to name a quality of something or of someone or something is a metaphysical activity. To count, to measure and weigh things, and quantify items is to be understood metaphysically. To situate a relation of things in time and space is to think metaphysically. To determine if something can be of use or not is basically a metaphysical consideration. Indeed, the need to categorize, give name to situate, and to organize, to isolate, to couple, etc., all are metaphysical activities. The other thing I'm noticing too that I don't have here, well, I do at the very beginning. So in other words, a quick glance at a college textbook will typically offer the study of metaphysics as a relationship between free will and determinism. So in other words, free will and determinism is probably the way in which philosophers usually deal with metaphysics as well. Okay? So there's all these different ways in which we're considering metaphysics. Are we free? Are we determined? Those are metaphysical questions, right? So also, once we take these observations into consideration, we suddenly recognize that metaphysics is not a useless artifact, only handled within the confines of the written word or in the classroom. Put in its most basic terms, metaphysics is conscious thinking with and combined with and without the physical world. So, in other words, metaphysics is covering a broad range of topics, but trying to pinpoint what it is specifically also has to do with how we understand what things are in general, what something is. So in other words, to study metaphysics is also to understand what thinking and how thinking is understood by us. Okay? So I think I'm going to stop it there, and we'll talk more about it later. Bye-bye.